camera.
You can be off camera. I think most time we are. I just like to be on camera. It gets to the human element. Shayla, are we ready?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, good morning. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're coming to you live from the Department of Local Affairs World Headquarters at 1313 Sherman Street in Denver. My name is Eric Bergman. I'm the Director of the Division of Local Government. Welcome to our Local Government Resources Call. This monthly call supports local governments and partner organizations in navigating historic, state, and federal funding opportunities and other resources that can help strengthen communities. Today's call is all about housing, transit-oriented development, and strategic growth, what it means for your community, and resources and funding for the implementation of the 2024 land use and housing legislation. But first, I have some DOLA updates I want to provide. In our state demography office, last week, Elizabeth Garner, Colorado state demographer, announced her retirement effective at the end of November. Elizabeth's invaluable contributions over 2 decades have made a significant impact on Colorado's economy, infrastructure, and social services. We're really going to miss Elizabeth. She is an absolute gem, and her office provides just amazing, amazing data that is crucial for any kind of land use and planning activities in your communities. Keep an eye out for the State Demography Office's vintage 2023 population estimates and forecasts on the SDO website on November 1st, 2024. And if you need something, you can contact them through, I think we're providing a link in the chat. The Census Bureau released the American Community Survey one-year data for 2023 last week, with 5-year data to be released on December 12th. This data will be updated on the SDO website this December. The 2024 State Demography Summit will be held at the Arvada Center on Friday, November 1st. Registration is open now through October 25th. Over in our Division of Housing has been developing scoring criteria to apply to upcoming quarterly competitive grant cycles for rental and homeownership projects. This criteria will help guide gap funding recommendations when funding requests exceed availability. We are looking for your feedback on this proposed criteria using the survey link in the chat by 5 p.m. on September 23rd. Proposition 123 commitment filings are now open. Municipalities and counties that did not file a 3-year commitment last year may now submit a 2-year commitment to increase their baseline of affordable housing by 6% over the next 2 calendar years by using our online form by the deadline of November 1st, 2024. Filing a successful commitment with DOH unlocks the availability of Proposition 123 funds to be deployed in your jurisdiction through 6 different programs, including homeownership, homelessness, local planning capacity, land banking, concessionary debt, and equity. The proposition funds transferred to DOLA and OEDA this fiscal year totaled more than $327 million. More information on Proposition 123 implementation is available on the Proposition 123 project page on Engage DOLA. Division of Local Government. This is the division that I head up. A friendly reminder that the local planning capacity grant deadline is September 30th for communities opted into Proposition 123. The microgrids for community resilience funding cycle is also open. Planning applications are rolling until funds are expended. Construction applications are due December 4th, 2024. Please visit the microgrids program website for more information and webinar recording. Land use implementation. We have received your feedback for parking and transit-oriented communities draft maps, and will publish the final maps on September 30th. The next monthly land use and housing engagement meeting will be held September 27th. Please visit the Land Use and Housing Engage DOLA page for meeting information. Also, note, we will soon be posting several new positions to build the team in the Community Development Office that will implement these new programs. So thank you for your patience while we build our team's capacity. Keep an eye on DOLA's hiring page for those postings. The Conservation Trust Fund program, which distributes dollars quarterly for acquisition, development, and maintenance of recreational properties, distributed $15 million last week to over 470 eligible local governments. If you participate in this program, you should see your quarterly distribution come through within the coming week. We now have some partner agency updates. First up, I'm going to call on Alyssa Dinberg in the governor's office. Alyssa?
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's having a great Wednesday. I think today's Wednesday. I just have a quick update for everyone. Our office has recently gone through a rebranding. We are formally the Governor's Office of Economic Recovery, and our new name is the Governor's Office of Federal Funds and Strategic Initiatives. So if you see that name listed on an email or anywhere, that is us. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about this at all. And I think that's all I got. I hope everyone has a lovely day.
Thanks, Alyssa. It's good to hear from you. Next up, we have Ari Moladina from the Colorado Energy Office.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thanks for having me on the call today. I just wanted to share an update with everyone that the APPS program, the APPS grant, is reopening tomorrow. And I'll put the website in the chat, but just a reminder that this is a fund that provides assistance to local and tribal governments for the adoption of an automated online solar permitting platform. So these platforms are able to verify the code compliance of permit applications and can typically issue permits in about 30 minutes. This doesn't replace the inspections process. That's all going to be the same, but this is going to basically automate that plan review process for solar permits that are pretty standardized. For permits that are out of the scope of kind of that norm, those would still kind of go through your normal permitting process. But generally, these platforms can really help save staff time that's normally done manually processing these permits. It can help reduce errors by providing installers and contractors that are entering these details with real-time feedback, and just generally make your community more solar friendly. So for a little bit of information about the grant itself, this is a non-competitive grant. It is first come, first served. It opens tomorrow, and awards would range from a maximum of $40,000 to $100,000. And this is really a capacity building grant to kind of acknowledge that, you know, sometimes it takes time to implement these new systems. And so the softwares themselves are generally free, but the grant will cover costs like any staff time that it would take to set up meetings or kind of coordinate the integration. If you wanted to put on trainings for solar installers in your community, those costs would be covered, as well as any sort of integration fees that perhaps your umbrella permitting software like an Acela or an iTrackIt would charge for that integration. So yeah, again, I'll put the website in the chat. The application materials will be available tomorrow, and then I'll put my email in there as well, and you can feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Ari. And last but not least, Odessa Gomez from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment with a program update.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having us on. I'm with the Indoor Air Quality Program at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and we have just launched a brand new EPA-funded program called the Wildfire Smoke Preparedness Program. This is a 3-year initiative. We are not providing grant funding, but what we are providing is outreach, education, and training for schools and community partners on how to prepare for and respond to wildfire smoke in buildings, so school buildings and community buildings. So the focus here is reducing the adverse impacts of wildfire smoke on our indoor air quality. We will be providing training and education on recognizing and responding to harmful levels of wildfire smoke, both indoors and outdoors, how to develop a wildfire smoke building readiness plan, how to establish and operate cleaner air centers in community serving buildings for equitable access to clean indoor air, and working with K through 12 schools to understand and prepare for impacts of smoke events. And if interested, schools that might want to serve as a community cleaner air center, so an area that the community can come to get a little bit of respite from harmful levels of smoke. So we're going to share some information about how to join our education and training network. We have a website up and running. We've got some resources on there for communities and schools to learn more about maintaining cleaner indoor air quality during wildfire smoke events. So we really encourage you to go ahead and sign up for the training network. You'll be receiving periodic updates with really helpful information, anywhere from building preparedness to understanding health impacts of wildfire smoke on community. We have 2 wildfire smoke building readiness webinars coming up. One is actually tomorrow. It is targeted for school building readiness. We'll share a link for that. These are free. If you do not directly deal with school buildings or community buildings, that's fine. These webinars are supposed to be, or they're designed to be high level enough so that you can share that information with those that do, but also actionable so that you yourself, if you do handle building readiness and preparedness, there's some really helpful information in there. So topics we'll be covering are health impacts of wildfire smoke, the basics of how smoke impacts indoor and outdoor air quality, resources for understanding and identifying those smoke impacts on air quality, how to receive alerts from CDPHE, as well as elements on school and community building readiness. We're going to have a community building oriented webinar on Thursday, October 3rd from 3 to 4. So again, we'll share that information. All this is free, and feel free to share it with others who you think would benefit. And yeah, we'll share our contact information for those that have questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Odessa. We can now dive into our local government resources webinar for today, which will be introduced by Shale Sabo from the Colorado Resiliency Office. Shale, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you everyone again for joining us for our Standing Funding Navigation Series webinar. As a reminder, in case this is the first time you are joining, this webinar series is to break down, the goal of this is to break down state and local funding opportunities to better help local governments and community partners navigate and access potential solutions for the challenges that they are facing. As mentioned, today's topic is on housing, transit-oriented development, and strategic growth. Today, we have a couple of wonderful speakers, including Casey McPherson, Senior Planner here at DOLA's Community Development Office, and Nathan Lindquist, who is a Senior Land Use Planner at the Colorado Department of Transportation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Casey to take away.
All right, thanks, Shale. And hello, everyone. I'm Casey McPherson, and excited to talk to you today about all of these topics. I would consider, housing and transit-oriented development to be special focus topics, and strategic growth can be considered a bit of an umbrella. So to start us off, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to say just a little bit about strategic growth. Make sure we're all steeped in the same information before we dive into the laws that we're currently implementing. So first off, what is strategic growth? A set of principles meant to achieve development patterns that are sustainable from multiple lenses: economic, environmental, social, etc. So in other words, strategic growth doesn't mandate prescriptive actions, but rather facilitates conversation. It helps with review of potential land use policies, programs, rules, all meant to consider things like promoting efficient use of land, infrastructure connectivity, preservation, human scale design, and good nodal development, as well as others, of course. Why does it matter? It provides communities with a better understanding of the full scope of costs and benefits, both short-term and long-term, as they're looking at strategies to address community needs such as housing. And then generally the goal there is to create more livable, sustainable, and affordable Colorado. And I bring that up because I think strategic growth is a foundational concept, thinking about the laws that we're working to implement in the Community Development Office. Next slide. So what are those laws exactly? Here's the list of them. I'm going to be doing a kind of mini deep dive into each of these, but for those that like to know where we're at, this is what we will be going through in almost exactly this order. Those of you paying close attention will see what I mean in a moment. But first, let's talk about where we are in implementation. Next slide will show you the project timeline. You can see a much more detailed version of this on our Engage DOLA site for these laws. Hopefully someone will drop that link in the chat, because I could only fit a small amount of the information that you may be interested in about timeline on a single slide. But to give you a sense of where we are, we're currently in drafting and engagement. So we completed our first implementation planning phase. And right now we're working on some initial drafting and kicking off engagement. So there are, as we dive into these laws, the numbers will make more sense, but all you may need to know for now is that we're working on drafting some maps, getting input on them, launching an engagement framework that I will walk through a little bit later. We're going to move this into the next phase, which is really kicking off tool development and team hiring. That's critical because across this suite of laws, we DOLA, in partnership with other agencies, working also closely with subject jurisdictions, opt-in jurisdictions, and listed interest groups, are developing a lot of tools, supportive tools, compliance tools meant to be used for subject jurisdictions and opt-in jurisdictions as they work towards compliance with these laws. So that's why we're so focused on tool development. More to come on that soon. We're also working on team hiring so that we will have staff to manage all the work you're about to hear about. After that, we'll go into some preliminary review, technical assistance, and launching grant programming. So all of that is meant to cover that we will be reviewing a lot of compliance reporting from subject jurisdictions, supporting work towards those reports, and launching our grant programs that I will mention with each law as I move through them. Okay, and then we also will be doing publishing and local reporting. So we've got across the laws, you'll see we've got a lot of menus to publish. Neighborhood center criteria is going to come up. You'll become more familiar with that soon. Receiving preliminary compliance reports, and then beyond the middle of next year, we will be continuing to review compliance, launching further grant programming, and publishing some state reports. Okay, mouthful for now, but that's just sort of a sneak peek at this project timeline. Again, please do visit Engage DOLA, where we have a more complete project timeline that does extend into 2028. Next slide. We're going to go ahead now and do our mini deep dive into each of these laws. Next slide, we'll start off with House Bill 24-1007. This is prohibit residential occupancy limits. Next slide. This one is a relatively straightforward one. I was able to fit it on one slide here. And this law prohibits local governments from limiting residential occupancy based on familial relationship. So you may be familiar with things like the definition of a family being blood relation, marriage, adoption. Some communities have like a U+2, that may ring a bell. So in other words, this law, as of this last legislative session, says not to limit according to familial relationship, but it does retain authority for local governments to limit residential occupancy based on other items such as demonstrated health and safety standards. What does that mean? Maybe International Building Code, Fire Code, CDPH&E water and wastewater standards, etc. And then there's compliance guidance now posted on our website. I hope someone will drop in the link to that. If you're curious for more information, check that out. And this law does apply statewide to all jurisdictions. All right, next slide. Now we're going to talk about minimum parking requirements, House Bill 24-1304. Next slide. This law has a little bit more going on. So by the middle of next year, for areas within metropolitan planning organizations, MPOs, and at least partially within applicable transit service areas, which are defined by that legislation, local governments must not enact or enforce local laws requiring minimum parking for multifamily residential, adaptive reuse for residential, or adaptive reuse for mixed use that includes 50% of use for residential. One common question that we get is, are there no parking then with multifamily residential? Not necessarily. There's still the flexibility for the other two main sources of parking requirements or considerations for projects, which are developers electing to add parking to their projects, as well as financiers requiring parking for their projects. So those other two legs of that particular stool remain. There is an applicability map. So that legislation directs us to publish a transit service area map by September 30th. I've I put a little screenshot of the map there on this slide. You can look at the interactive version of this map on our Engage DOLA webpage if you want to scroll in and check some things out. So again, the transit service areas were defined in legislation, and this map was initially presented in our monthly meetings that Eric referenced on August 23rd, I believe was the first one. We've received input and have been incorporating and updating the map, and we'll present that at the next monthly meeting, which is next Friday. We're also working to publish best practices and technical assistance materials by the end of this calendar year. And then there's a small piece on a local government annual reporting, but it's a rather narrow exception. It's for in small instances or rare instances where local government may choose to still have a parking requirement. So I will just brush by that for now, but if you have questions on that, we can certainly talk more. Okay, let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about accessory dwelling units. This is House Bill 24-1152. Next slide. Components of this one. In general, the ADU law requires that subject jurisdictions allow an ADU wherever single family is allowed. It applies to local governments within metropolitan planning organizations, MPOs, and to municipalities with 1,000 or more in population, and census designated places, CDPs, with 40,000 or more in population. The approval of these ADUs must be administrative approval, in other words, no public hearing, and there are restrictions such as not applying parking or owner occupancy requirements. There are limited exceptions to that, and there are also some minimal design standards. So more questions, please bring them on, but for now, I'll go on to the next slide with continuing the components. There's also a certification process that comes along with this law. So subject jurisdictions, as well as those that choose to opt in, will submit a compliance report. That is one of those tools we talked about. We need to create the form of the compliance report. And so that is forthcoming and will be part of the monthly meeting discussion. But generally, what to know now, there will be a compliance report process. Subject jurisdictions and those that want to opt in also must implement at least one strategy to encourage ADU construction or conversion. And then, of course, if you're not a subject jurisdiction but want to be, then there's the option to opt in. Why do that? There's a grant program associated with this law, the Fee Reduction and Encouragement Grant Program. It can fund a number of things like pre-approved ADU plans, so developing those plans, local technical assistance, so local governments providing technical assistance, or fee reduction support. There's also additional funding options through CHAFA. That is not in my lane, so I will spare you and not speak out of my depth on that. Okay, next slide. Here's some key dates to know for this ADU law. Compliance reports are due by June 30th of next year. This is a one-time reporting process. And then we will be looking over those reports, working with any communities if there's any clarification needed or extension needed, things like that. And once we've made it through that process, we'll be able to launch the Fee Reduction and Encouragement Grant Program. So that's why at the very bottom of the slide, you'll see approximately Q3 or Q4 of 2025 to give us time to check that compliance and then launch that program right up. We're also going to be putting together a toolkit to support communities working in this space. And there's also some work going on at DOH for a factory built structure model code. All right, cruising right along, next slide. Now we're gonna dig into the housing planning law before we touch on the transit-oriented communities. So this one's Senate Bill 24-174, and here are the components. It's generally, we often for short call it the housing planning law. So it does have a longer name, but just so for your accessibility, if I just say housing planning, that's what I'm talking about, because it generally focuses on housing planning. The first piece is requiring housing needs assessments. Who must do those? It's all local governments of 1,000 or more in population. There's an exception, except if that community has had a negative population change of 1% or more in the last sentence, census, or if they participated in a regional housing needs assessment. A regional housing needs assessment can be a benefit, by the way. I'll just a couple comments here before I move along, if you'll permit me. Why consider a regional housing needs assessment? Well, one, yes, it does provide the flexibility to lean on that process and then just do a housing action plan. But there are some other things to think about as well. Regional processes, we've been closely watching Dr. Cogg's regional housing needs assessment process. And some notable things from that is a benefit of being able to develop a consistent, data-informed, and sort of equity-centered approach to analysis. So working regionally and thinking about regions where residents live, work, shop, recreate, how that's all connected across jurisdictional boundaries can inform sort of a bigger picture thinking. It can ground some of the future local action in a shared understanding of the region's diverse housing needs. And it can still leave open the flexibility in responding to the context of each community across that region. If you have more questions on that, we're always interested in hearing and can talk further, but those are things that I think are notable for the time being. So that's a few comments on the regional housing needs assessment. Now, another thing to comment on before we move on is that housing needs assessments per this law must conform to a methodology that DOLA has been directed to create and make available by the end of this calendar year. There are a number of requirements in statute that must go into that housing needs assessment. And if you're curious to hear more, please do consider engaging in our broader engagement framework, which I will go over in just a little bit, because that will be full of outreach in developing that methodology. And it's on, as you may suspect by this date here, a rather expedited timeline. Okay, so next up is housing action plans. Local governments of 5,000 or more in population, or 1,000 or more that participated in a regional housing needs assessment or a rural resort community as of the first of this year, must create a housing action plan. So that's the sort of so what and the action portion of the housing needs assessment. Next up, there are some requirements in 174, the housing planning law, about comp plans. So moving forward, and I have a slide with more detail on this, but comp plans must include a strategic growth element and a water supply element by the end of 2026. So more on that to come, if you wouldn't mind holding your curiosity for just a couple moments. And then also we have a grant program. So we'll be administering a funding program for housing needs planning, technical assistance for those housing needs assessment work. Next slide. But wait, there's more. So this slide covers a few other things that we're doing per 174. First off, a directory of affordability strategies and displacement mitigation strategies. We're also going to be leading, facilitating, and publishing 2 state reports, a statewide strategic growth report and a natural and agricultural interjurisdictional opportunities report. For state grants criteria, there's direction to update state grants criteria to prioritize projects in neighborhood centers or supporting neighborhood centers, as well as to prioritize local governments who are compliant with these laws. So have done the HNAs or HAPs, updated the comp plan, that sort of thing. So we're directed to start incorporating that into our grants criteria. And then finally, there's a lot of direction on providing technical assistance, materials, training tools, templates, functioning as a clearinghouse and beyond. Next slide. Here is a summary of the key dates, hoping to pull everything that I just mentioned together. So again, by the end of this calendar year, we are directed to publish methodologies for state, regional, and local housing needs assessments. And displacement assessment guidance. By the middle of next year, we're publishing affordability menus, the displacement strategy directory, and neighborhood center criteria. Also later next year, we will be publishing the statewide strategic growth report and the other report, natural and ag lands report. Now bumping forward a little bit, by the end of 2026 is when we're meant to update our grant criteria to prioritize those neighborhood centers. And then also at that same time is when local housing needs assessments are due to DOLA for acceptance. Moving all the way into 2027, as I mentioned, if you went to Engage DOLA, you would see all the way through 2028, is when we're going to publish the statewide HNA as well as a report on HNAs. And then by the 1st of 2028, housing action plans are to be posted locally and submitted to DOLA. Okay, next slide. As promised, just a little bit more information here on housing needs assessments as well as comp plans. So first off, if you're wondering about whether an existing HNA might be compliant with the requirements of 174, we have created some self-assessment guidance. I'm assuming that these slides get shared. That question has probably already come up in the chat. I don't have the chat in front of me. So we did create some initial self-assessment guidance. As you could understand, since we haven't yet developed the methodology, we're unable to review an HNA and say with certainty whether it complies with 174 or not. However, there's a lot of information in 174 about what must be in the methodology and in housing needs assessments. So based on that, we created this preliminary self-assessment guidance so that communities can start looking at what they have in place and get a sense of where they may be at and what their remaining questions still are. Also, you probably saw a lot of strategy menus and adopting strategies as we've been talking. So we did create a consolidated menu of strategies across these laws. If you're looking for some thoughts on strategies, then you may go ahead and take a look at that initial stuff as well. So as you saw, we aren't mandated to publish a final menu until sometime next year, but still we've been doing programming in this space for a while, and there were some solid lists in the legislation, and so we've created that consolidated menu there. Okay, next up, comp plans. So as I mentioned, per this legislation, comp plans must include a water supply element. So that includes 3 main steps, and truly these are steps that we tend to see taken for water supply elements in comp plans when they are included. Those are consulting with water suppliers in the area, review and estimate facilities and infrastructure needs, and including water conservation strategies. For the strategic growth element, this one, by the words of the legislation, is meant to discourage sprawl and promote development of vacant underutilized land, mitigate the need for infrastructure extensions or impacts to ag lands. This element must describe policies that are in place or may be considered, analyze developable parcels for infill or for transit-oriented development, TOD, and analyze non-adjacent parcels as well. Must you include this? Well, you would be exempt from having to include a strategic growth element if you haven't received funding to do so, and either you have a population of 20,000 or less with a negative population change, or a population of 2,000 or less. All right, so that's what I have for now, and then I'm going to hand it over to Nathan Lindquist from CDOT to take us through the transit-oriented communities. If we can go to the next slide.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Nathan Lindquist. I'm a senior land use planner at CDOT. And in general, myself and a few others are involved with assisting DOLA with implementing 1313 under one part of the legislation that directs CDOT to support DOLA in this. And so we are kind of helping with a lot of the outreach and other things. In general, CDOT is also engaged in a statewide planning process to think about, how does transit work throughout the state, but most of CDOT's work is separate from this bill, but I just wanted to give that explanation, a little bit of where we're involved and where we're not. But in general, HB 24-1313, transit-oriented communities, is applicable within metropolitan planning organizations, and those communities are listed on the right side of the screen that have transit frequency at 15 minutes or less, or bus rapid transit routes or light rail stations. In addition to, there's kind of some size requirements and other things, and a few counties that are mostly kind of in the Dr. Cog region that also apply. So for everyone else outside, if you're outside of those jurisdictions, what will be most important to you is to focus on this neighborhood centers piece, which is kind of like, you could almost think of it as TOD light, is maybe appropriate for the mountain area of the state or more rural area of the state. And so there'll be a lot more about neighborhood centers coming out next winter and spring. So a lot of this presentation may not be as applicable to you if you're outside the MPO, but do stay tuned as we get further into the year and next year for the neighborhood centers discussion. Next slide. So this is a quick interview for those communities listed on that last slide of how the housing opportunity goal calculation is going to work. And really what's important to gather from this is that the housing opportunity goal is not a requirement that these communities need to allow a certain number of housing units, or to actually build, excuse me, let me say that again, to actually build a certain number of housing units. It's really just a requirement that they allow the zoning capacity for these units to be built, knowing that, of course, what's constructed is not going to fill up all of the zoning capacity that a community has. So it's really just looking at, zoning is one barrier towards housing, but it's not the only barrier. We also know there's market demand that can be a barrier. There's infrastructure that can be a barrier. And so this bill is primarily focused on zoning capacity, and that's a really important point to understand. It's also not requiring that you have to do 40 units an acre in the whole area around these transit routes and transit stations. The overall goal is something you calculate, and then you can, as a local jurisdiction, decide to put that density in greater amounts in some areas or lesser amounts in other areas, or in some areas no density, because it may not make sense in areas where there's no infrastructure, or the community just hasn't planned for that or is uncomfortable with it. So there's a lot of flexibility in where you put it. So if you are with one of these jurisdictions and want to be involved on a technical level, if you're a local planner, we're doing a lot of outreach and stakeholding on that to prepare for the preliminary report next June. So please get in touch with us if you're not already involved there. And then communities really have until 2027 to complete their final zoning and strategies. And the 3-year status reports after that are really just a quick check to say, has anything changed with your zoning? Great. No, then keep going. The housing opportunity goal will not change over time every 3 years. It's a one-time snapshot of the goal. And even if transit changes over time, the goal stays the same. Next slide. So this gives a quick snapshot of some more dates, a little bit that we covered over there, but we're kind of in that first rush of trying to publish the transit area and walkshed maps and then get out the HOG calculation guidance. And then you can kind of see some other key milestones along the way as we get to the final 2027 when it becomes state law to have complied with the housing opportunity goal. Next slide. So some of the resources that'll be available to assist local governments is there is a TOC infrastructure grant program. There's going to be an early round of this in Q4 of 2025 that DOLA will be administrating. And this will basically, we know there are some communities that already meet the housing opportunity goal based on their current zoning. And so this will be a way to kind of give some reward to those communities and say, great job, you've already met it. Here's some infrastructure, since we know infrastructure is one of the other key barriers to creating housing. And then there'll be another grant program a round of the grant program in 2027. There's also an additional tranche of affordable housing tax credits in the bill that will be administered by CHAFA, and that will be available to housing developments in transit centers and neighborhood centers around the state. So that, and we should say both these programs, both the infrastructure grant program and the tax credits, are available to neighborhood centers too. So they will be open statewide. The technical assistance that DOLA provides then is going to be ongoing, and that's one of the things I'm here to help DOLA provide, just because the dates on all this bill are very quick and we're moving ahead. So excited to work with you all on this, and we'll again kind of get more in the neighborhood centers probably in the winter and spring. Next slide. Is that it for me? Yes. Back to you, Casey, I think.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nathan. Okay, as promised, I'm going to take us through some quick discussion on implementation and engagement. So if you're wondering, wow, that was a lot. How do we learn more? How do we opt in? How do we otherwise engage with this as it's ongoing? The time is now. Next slide is a reminder on the timeline we talked about and what's going on right now. So please do remember that there's been a lot of work to set up everything that's launching, but truly we've only just begun. There's a lot to come. So next slide is the full scope of our engagement framework. To take you through from the top, we have a local government advisory group. This is an email-based thread to keep membership organizations, MPOs, others informed and able to promote engagement opportunities to their members. And also, by the way, let us know anything that they may have been hearing, any kind of tool or tweak to a tool that might be helpful for us to do to sort of help the whole process and those participating. The big thing that we have going on in this framework is the monthly tool-based engagement. So that's that monthly meeting that Eric referenced at the top. This is a chance for agencies, like Nathan said, this is very much partnership to get it done kind of approach. So this monthly meeting is for agencies to present drafts of tools, gather input on those, or maybe show a final draft and how input has been incorporated and refinements have been made for these tools that are going to support subject jurisdictions, opt-in jurisdictions, and interest groups listed in the legislation. But it is open, you can register, anyone can, to see what's going on. We also do post recordings of the meetings on our Engage DOLA site. So you can go ahead at your leisure, fast forward if you want to, if that's how you'd rather engage. And then we have a couple of direct offerings. So we have bi-weekly office hours. That's meant to protect some time to dive deep into the weeds with subject jurisdictions to ask jurisdiction-specific questions, and supplemental one-on-one. If those office hours don't work, we are certainly open to other times that do work better for subject jurisdictions to talk about some of the nuances across these laws. We're also doing ad hoc presentations. So there's some additional responsive engagement that we do for interested parties as requested. And then finally, we have ongoing web-based engagement. So our Engage DOLA webpage hosts recordings of meetings, agenda information, FAQs, and draft implementation tools for comment. So if you're wondering, how to comment on a tool or get a sense of what's coming up, that is the first place to go to try and get some information that you may be looking for. But if you don't find it still, then please do always let me know. All right, next slide. A couple comments on engagement and TA key dates. Now, not exactly related, but I did want to plug that tomorrow at 9 is the Housing Strategies Peer Exchange. And then again, every Friday from 9:30 to 10:30 are those office hours that I mentioned. Our next monthly engagement meeting will be next Friday, September 27th. So our first one was August 23rd. Next one is coming up soon here. By the end of the month, we'll be publishing the maps for the parking and the TOC laws. And then by the end of the calendar year, we'll be publishing the H&A methodologies and displacement assessment guidance. So those are the top of mind key next dates to be thinking about. And then next slide. Okay, a couple comments on Prop 123 and our local planning capacity grant. Thank goodness Robin DeFalco, the program manager, is on the line here in case you have questions. But to keep us moving right along, I'll say that the requirements here of Prop 123 expedited review is that local governments implement expedited review or fast track for affordable housing. We did gather stakeholder feedback from the fall of 2023 through the spring of 24 and publish guidance materials on that requirement. So take a look if you're interested. And we have provided a list of strategies, technical assistance, and funding available to help with implementation. So speaking of funding, next slide. We are administering the Local Planning Capacity Grant Program. So that program is meant to support local government's capacity to address affordable housing, so especially that expedited review, as well as planning capacity to develop affordable housing, implement strategies, achieve Prop 123 commitments, and affordable housing goals. So the whole scope is fast track plus capacity. And what does this program look like exactly? Next slide will show you how much funding we've awarded so far, $4.4 million to 70 local governments. Please note that there's a current funding cycle open with applications due September 30th. The next funding cycle will be in February 2025. And again, please do feel free to reach out to Robin DeFalco with questions on that. So that's a lot of stuff all geared towards housing and a strategic growth and potentially special focus on TOD, etc. And we can go to the next slide and just kind of end there. There's my contact information. Again, the link to our Engage DOLA site. And thank you so much for your time and attention, and ready for Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Casey and Nathan, for all of that wonderful information. We definitely have a couple of questions. I'll start with the first one here. And Nathan, I think you tried to answer it in the chat, but the way Zoom is, it doesn't look like it went to everyone, just to the panelists, unfortunately. But the question is, how does strategic growth differ from the smart growth policies or initiative under Governor Romer in the 1990s? I don't know if you want to just speak to that out loud or go a little bit more in depth on that question.
Yeah, great question. And sorry for messing up the Zoom. It is a really good question to think about. Obviously, in the 90s, early 2000s, there was the Smart Growth Initiative in Colorado, and of course, nationwide, really, in the planning profession. And now we're kind of looking at this as a strategic growth. And what's the similarities and difference? I mean, I think now compared with the 90s, obviously there are some issues that are much more front and center, including the housing crisis and including the inequality crisis between, not of course only between residents of the state, but we've got some communities with a lot of resources and very different issues, and then other communities that have a great disparity in resources between the wealthier communities. So there's a lot, those are different aspects, but what I'd say is similar to the Smart Growth Initiative is the overall principle that if we are building compact, walkable, transit-supported neighborhoods that allow folks to have a lower transportation cost burden, communities in the state to have a lower infrastructure cost burden over time, that is a more sustainable and cost-effective way for the state to grow and for people to live. As well as like providing all the quality of life benefits that the Smart Growth Initiative of the 90s also talked about. I think that's all still relevant. Maybe another thing I think the state is putting more emphasis on with strategic growth now is the real need for infrastructure spending to encourage transit-oriented development and infill development, what these bills are calling transit centers and neighborhood centers. And that's something I was pretty young in the 90s, but I don't remember as much of that then, but there probably was a good amount of it. But I think at least as far as the state of Colorado has been directed to look at things in these bills, and especially at CDOT, we are as well, is how do we make all these pieces fit together from transportation to water and sewer infrastructure and everything else that needs to happen to make this work. So those are a couple of thoughts on it, but obviously this is just my opinion and anyone else could probably have a different take on it and also be right.
Great, thank you, Nathan. The next question was answered in the chat, but just in case we have folks that maybe don't have access to the chat, can communities that are in the, excuse me, DRCOG region use that regional needs assessment, or do they have to do their own thing? So Casey and Nathan, if you don't mind kind of reiterating the answer to that question.
Sure. Yes, the answer to that question is a community that participates in DRCOG's regional HNA process would be covered by that under 174. Now, please note that it hasn't yet been determined whether that RHNA conforms to the methodology that we're meant to create by the end of the calendar year. So whether or not that community could sort of be exempt, so to speak, from creating the local HNA is to be determined. But yes, they would be covered. So that's both a yes and still an open question.
Great, thank you. The next question says, what is the collaboration methodology with rural fire departments' capability, such as staffing, equipment, et cetera, to ensure the safety and well-being of residents in public/affordable housing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Oh, Nathan, you unmuted. Were you wanting to answer?
Oh, I can, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, please fill in if I leave any gaps. I would say that we're working to have a very like open engagement process to receive input on all these things. It is generally true that the bulk of the laws that we've discussed are more opt-in options for rural areas. So I would say first and foremost, that is considered applicability, but we do welcome input because we want to consider and support providing guidance for multiple contexts. So that's sort of how I would think about starting to answer that question. Nathan, anything to add on that?
Yeah, great answer. I think that issue with rural fire departments, and I was city planning director out in Rifle, Colorado for many years, so definitely understand the issues. But I think that's one of the reasons why the legislation doesn't have a housing requirement to build housing in rural areas, because issues like rural fire departments are so much more varied in their resource levels. So I think, as Casey said, it'd be a great topic to discuss if folks are interested, but it is an important issue.
Great. The next question says, does receipt of an EAF grant, so that's our Energy and Mineral Impact Fund, to partially support development of a comprehensive plan count as a requirement to include a strategic growth element under the quote, have received funding criterion?
Yes, I would point to Andy Hill's response in the chat there. So for those who are listening only, I would say it says generally it does. However, we recommend that you talk with your regional manager since every context is a little different, for example, timing, scope, etc. So connect with your regional manager is the answer on that one, because that's a good way to get rolling on that.
Great, thank you, Casey. Can you please address how DOLA is addressing feedback from municipalities that 1313 and parking maps are very, if not overly aggressive, especially given the very short turnaround time?
Yeah, sure. So the maps from 1304 parking and 1313 TOC are, so the timeline for those again is that we publish them by the end of September. We have been meeting directly with communities truly even before the legislation was passed, just to try and see where we were at, and recognizing that if that date stuck, it would be pretty quick to engage and look at where things landed. And now that that has passed, we've been engaging even more directly. So thinking back on that engagement slide, we did, in addition to meeting one-on-one, we did introduce the draft maps at our first monthly meeting on August 23rd. We offered, by way of providing input and comment, we offered both the Engage DOLA web-based site. We have a question submittal form on there, as well as direct one-on-one technical assistance. We did receive questions and comments from subject jurisdictions on both of those maps. The other thing to note is the maps are, the legislation is rather prescriptive about how to create those maps. So those discussions have been deeply technical. Well, does this type of plan fall under that definition? Or, there's this kind of route that is actually intermittent. Is it intermittent in the way that complies or not? So it's really got this just to give you a flavor of how in the weeds it's gotten. And we found the one-on-one meetings to be just the absolute best space to gain some clarity on that. The questions have been informative and highly technical. And so we're looking forward to next Friday being able to show the final draft maps and how that input has been incorporated.
And I would just reiterate that DOLA doesn't have a lot of room for discretion or interpretation with how prescriptive the legislation is. And so mostly what we're checking with is just accuracy with the legislation, but there's not a lot of room to deviate from what is very narrowly prescribed.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left and just a few more questions. What is a good way to see how jurisdictions are successfully navigating House Bill 1152? Specifically, I'm interested in how HOAs that prohibit ADUs are accepting ADUs by right. Should this person look into their MPO or DOLA, or is there a better person to be directed to?
A great question. And yeah, we are going to be working on the ADU toolkit that is meant to provide guidance, case studies, that kind of information. So I know it's unsatisfying, but there is more information to come. In the meantime, we have some information on our website already from the 1271 and Strong Communities Programming. ADUs have been a part of that, not exactly in the same way, right? Like I recognize that your question truly is about 1152 and HOAs, and so that may be unsatisfying, but we are working to build that out. So that's part of our tool development that's going to be going on over the next several months.
Thank you. The next question is, when will the Housing Needs Planning Technical Assistance Fund be available? It might have been mentioned earlier and they might have missed it.
Oh, now I'm thinking I didn't mention it. And I believe our hope is to launch that early 2025. Oh man, I'm kind of questioning myself on that. That's a great detail. I hope you'll all forgive me that there's so many details at once. Sometimes a jumble happens. If anyone wants to correct me, please do step in on the chat. If we can't do that in the moment, then I'll make sure to put an estimate on our timeline on the Engage site. So you'll be able to check back there for clarification.
Thank you, Casey. And as a reminder for everyone, if we don't have the answer perfectly today, we will follow up with our running Q&A log and we can get more concrete answers later on. Fidel, I see your question here regarding volunteer service. We do have your email address if you've registered for this call. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and reach out to you after the call to figure out specifically what interest you have in volunteer work, and we'll get you connected to the right person. But thank you for asking your question. And then we just have one last question before I turn it back over to Eric. I am working with a school district and they have land to build affordable housing development exclusively for teachers. They need funds for design and construction for utilities. How can they work with the state? It is in El Paso County, but they would build it as a combined, sorry, the chat keeps jumping around on me. It is in El Paso County, but they would build it as a combined campus for workforce development / trade school and affordable housing.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that could come down to a number of grant programs. For the programs that we talked about today, I'm not seeing a clean line to one of those, but I would say keep an eye on how those programs develop. I'm not the one that comes most to mind would be the TOC Infrastructure Fund, but again, that just sort of depends on lots of things. Like that program hasn't even been developed yet. So, oh, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, but I was just thinking about some existing funds, and Robin's got some ideas in the chat. So, there could be some energy impact funds. Talk to your regional manager, but certainly, um, talk to your division of housing, housing development specialist. Sorry, I always call them DEVOs, because they know of all different kinds of sources that could be helpful, including CHAFA if you have more more of that pre-development work to do, or they have a specific pre-development funding source now. But again, it's Prop 123, so it would have to be for a 123 opt-in community.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And that wraps up all the Q&A for today. As a reminder, we will send out a follow-up email after this call with all of the slides and the questions from today. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Eric to close us out.
Thanks, Shale. I want to thank all of our speakers and participants for joining us today. Look for a follow-up email with the meeting recording and materials from today's call. Please join us for our next local government resources call on October 16th, where we will cover grant implementation and monitoring. And just to reiterate, all notes and Q&A will go out following each call. Thank you, guys. Thanks for joining today. Have a great week. We're Wednesday. Have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you all next month on the next call. Thanks so much.